Welcome to the Two Gurus Talk Compliance podcast with me, Kristy Granthart. I'm here with the one and only Tom Fox. This week, we're covering the lies people tell about titles not mattering for CCO jobs, the lack of faith executives have in their board members, the fight about whether the EU AI Act is bigger than GDPR, and Florida man's impersonation of a famous pizza maker using fraudulent flyers. But first, Tom, how has your week been and what do you think is the most interesting development?
For me, Christy, I have been in Washington at one of two of the top podcast conferences held annually in the United States. It was at the Gaylord. So many compliance professionals will be familiar with the Gaylord. And it was just a fabulous conference. I learned a ton of things. We are definitely going to upgrade our game here at the Compliance Podcast Network. And it's a very different world, that world, than compliance. And I love playing in that. And I love playing in compliance. So now I get to play in compliance with you and in a podcast.
What's not to love about this? Let's start with one of our good friends, SBF, right?
SBF. And I have to introduce this article a little bit because, frankly, I almost thought about spending the whole podcast on this article. This is exactly the article that I envisioned, or the type of article that I envisioned when I had this vision of having a podcast with you. It is tangentially about compliance. It's about philosophy. It's about the criminal justice system. It's about trials. And I just found, and it involves obviously one of the most interesting characters in the 21st century, Sam Bankman-Fried, and perhaps one of my top 5 favorite living authors, Michael Lewis. I've read everything he's done, starting with Liar's Poker and everything going through. And if I could set this up a little bit, he was embedded with SBF and their team up until just before it all came crashing down in 2022, I guess. And his book came out literally the week before Sam Bankman-Fried went to trial. And the book did not reflect really anything that came out after Michael Lewis left, his embedment. And it was a glowing hagiography of SBF. I can't think of any other way to put it. Now, SBF is an interesting character, and he's obviously very different than almost everyone. He's certainly very different than you and me. He's a very smart man. There's no question about that. But one side of his brain just doesn't seem to work as well as the other side. And so he goes to trial. We've talked about that trial in this podcast. I won't say he lies because I'm not sure there's a definition of truth that fits into his world. This is not Donald Trump, 333 lies in 40 minutes of jammering. This is that none of that matters. And the only thing that matters is what's the most utility for the greatest number of people in this decision, whether it's a coin flip to destroy the world via nuclear war or to give everybody $100 million. If that's it, and he makes that decision based on that starkness. At any rate, goes to trial, found guilty pretty quickly because he clearly violated basic U.S. securities laws, which you can't commingle customer funds in your investment arm. They have to be segregated. And of everything he did, that's the clearest illegal act that he did. Goes to trial, found guilty. The judge then throws out the sentencing guidelines and sentences him to 35 years because he doesn't believe SBF has any remorse and that he would absolutely do it again if he had a chance. And it's one thing we know in America from The Great Gatsby, there are second acts in the American life. That's sort of the setup. And Michael Lewis wrote an addendum chapter to his book. I have not read the full addendum. I don't think it's out, but he did post a lengthy piece in the, or summary of it in the not the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post op-ed. And we've linked to it, and I really would encourage everyone to read it. But it's really 2 or 3 things going on. Number one, and I was very disappointed in Michael Lewis. It's not a Michael Lewis mea culpa, I got it wrong. It's a Michael Lewis, You just don't understand like I understand. It's a very nuanced approach to SPF, to what happened. And Michael Lewis not saying, oh, I didn't see it or, oh, my bad. It's like, no, there's something else here and you just didn't see it. So I was very disappointed in that part of it. What he did, I thought, a very good job of explaining why Sam Bankman Fried is the way he is, whether it's autism, whether it's Asperger's, whatever it may be that makes him the unique character he is in terms of not his IQ smarts, but his lack of empathy and seeing everything. I really didn't think it was so much the lack of empathy, it's the seeing everything. I'm a transactional guy and I see the world in transaction. I'm a Texan and I talk about money all the time. But SBF takes it way beyond that. Every decision is the most utility for the most people. Right now, this decision. And if that impacts another decision, we'll make another decision. We don't multi-level think. We don't play five-dimensional chess. We make the decision based on that criteria. And that type of criteria, you and I in our respective businesses might be able to do that. But if you're have a $35 billion business and you're literally making billions of dollars of decisions with other people's money, you have to have some controls around that. And it really drove home to me the need and why you have SOX 404 controls, why you have financial and accounting controls, and certainly why you have compliance controls. Like I said, I almost suggested we just do the whole episode on this, and it really impacted me. And I really want people to read it and obviously judge for themselves. But Michael Lewis almost comes to the point which says maybe these people need to be put in another category. Maybe Elon Musk needs to be treated differently. Maybe Jeff Bezos needs to be treated differently. They put on their pants like I do, one leg at a time, and they're still men and they're still subject. If you want to do business, you're still subject to the rules that everybody else has to play by, just like the Compliance Podcast Network has to, just like our consulting has to. And I don't think there needs to be a second set of rules. And they may have done very well, and they may have gotten very lucky, and they may be very smart, and they may be all of those things. But it doesn't change the fact that there are some basic rules you have to follow. And when you take people's money in, you can't use it to fund your own investment vehicle. Certainly not without telling people. At the most basic, it's that 35 years is a long time. Who knows what Sam Bankman Fried may come up with in jail? According to stories, he was already setting up different ways to invest in the jailhouse environment, whether it's cigarettes, whether it's food, whether it's whatever it may be. Who knows? But as probably you've now figured out and our listeners have now figured out, this article really impacted me. And I was very disappointed in Michael Lewis's ultimate conclusion. I think everybody has to kind of play by the same rules. And I think that's what gives the level playing field that allows people like you and me to compete in our businesses as well.
Yeah. I mean, it was quite an article I watched. I just came home from London and there was one of the NBC, I think it was NBC, sort of deep dive hour and a half specials on the SBS experience in the world. And they had a compliance officer at the end of it that had been hired by FTX and she was about 25. And there was a lot of commentary throughout the whole episode about how this multi-billion-dollar company was being run with no one over the age of 30. And age doesn't necessarily give you wisdom, but in compliance, experience tends to. So she said, I think they hired me because I didn't know anything. I thought, yeah, that sounds right from a compliance perspective. Oh my. Thank you, Tom, for bringing that one up. I think it's a really good article. Everyone should read it. It is, as he said, very nuanced in terms of its approach. And I think raises a lot of questions and not many answers. So take a look and make your own decision. Um, I would like to move to Mary Shirley, friend of the pod, as we all know, and friend of mine personally. She wrote an article for Corporate Compliance Insights, which, as Tom, there is so much good stuff coming out of that. Shout out to Sarah Haddon, who is the editor and owner. She's doing great. Mary wrote one of my favorite mic drop moment articles. She wrote, Titles Don't Matter and Other Lies I've Been Told. So it goes through the incredibly frustrating process of trying to negotiate titles and roles in our industry and constantly hearing, especially from recruiters, that, oh, don't worry, titles don't matter. It's the job you're doing. She noted that some recruiters say that the company's titles aren't commensurate with chief. So, chief isn't one of the possibilities. We could go with something else. But the idea that titles don't matter is a lie, in Mary's opinion. And I agree with her. She notes that some people respond to chief title with respect and approval. I mean, power within organizations is, for better or worse, it's denoted immediately by title. And that's why it's so important. And the DOJ knows it's important. That's why they say it. And the chief title also opens doors externally. So there are conferences where you only get to go if you're a chief, and trying to get the next chief job is infinitely easier when you have a previous one on your resume. So she finishes the article by imploring hiring managers to acknowledge the importance of titles and stop gaslighting people, telling them they aren't important because they are. So my personal story about this, Tom, is when I was interviewing for my role at that joint venture of Paramount and Universal Pictures, the title on the job opening was head of compliance. But when I got the offer on the paper, it said chief compliance officer as the title. And I literally almost fell over and I called my mom. I'm like, Mom, my career is freaking made. And she's like, what are you talking about? I said, from this day forward, I will always have been a chief compliance officer. And it continues to open doors 14 years later or something. So I think the titles matter enormously, but I don't know, Tom. Do you agree with Mary and me, or do you think the titles really aren't that big a deal? It's your experience.
So 20 years ago, my father gave me one of two pieces of advice for life in the corporate world. And I was at Halliburton, traveling all over the world, living this great life as a literally worldwide troubleshooter for contracts, and three times around the world in 6 months kind of travel. And I got a job offer to be the general counsel at a $130 million company. And so I called my dad and he said, once they put the gold bars on your shoulders, they can never take them away. Take the job.
Mm.
And he was absolutely right. He said they can fire you short of stripping you of your office, but through the state bar, you will always be a general counsel. And it doesn't matter if it's a 3-person company or a 30,000 person company, you're the general counsel. So she is absolutely right. And once they put the gold bars on her shoulder, she will have that forever. You have that forever. And there's exactly right. And once you get those gold bars, and he was a naval officer, and that's what he was referring to. And once you become an officer, you're an officer for the rest of your life. And it's he viewed every job not for that job, but he viewed that he played the long game. You're doing it for your 2 jobs down the road. And he said, 2 jobs down the road, you want to be able to say, yeah, when I was the general counsel, we did this. It plays absolutely within the company you're working for. And it's extraordinarily important because we both work in the corporate world and we
Mhm.
both know titles matter, but it matters down the road for your next position, whatever that might be, whether it's in law, compliance, or other. And then number 3, you'll always have those gold bars. You'll always be a former chief compliance officer. I'll always be a former general counsel. Dad was right back then, and Mary's right now.
Love it. All right. We're sticking with our CCI theme for this one. Tom, what did you want to talk about?
Yeah, so this one really intrigued me, and let me pull it up so I make sure I get it right. It is entitled Trust but Verify, obviously channeling her inner Nancy Reagan or Ronald Reagan, the power of audits to protect your competitive advantage. And it was by Jennifer Anderson, Adam Baldridge, and Nicole Riccio. And it really made me think about auditing in a different way because you and I both try to convey that compliance is a business positive. I try to say it is that effective compliance, equates to better business efficiency, it equates to greater ROI. They have taken that to internal audit. And frankly, I had never thought of internal audit that way. I thought of them as a retrospective look back, a deep dive to see if there was anything there. And they said, no, it certainly can be that, but you can use it on a forward looking basis as well. And so I really wanted to bring that concept to compliance officers, and every compliance officer If you don't know your internal audit, head of internal audit, you better go down there when this podcast ends and meet them. But start to have that conversation. And certainly these authors are very excited about that. Jonathan Marks, who is a panelist on everything compliance and is an internal auditor, bu- continually tells us internal audit is far too underutilized. And because they're giving us information. And certainly it's information to see, did we make a mistake? Did we violate the law? Do we need to restate our financials? All of those, certainly appropriate. But that information can be used to make your company run more efficiently. And I, for one, never thought of internal audit like that. And I should, and we should. And if you're a compliance officer, I'm sure your internal audit team, you're not asking them to do something new and different. You're taking what they're doing and kind of reformatting it and analyzing it. I thought it was a great article. Certainly opened my eyes.
Yeah, she was talking about the specific use case was about protecting essentially trade secrets and confidential information and using audit proactively to do that by making sure that things like non-disclosure agreements are in place and not relying on your non-competes ultimately. So having essentially a pre-record of training for confidentiality, et cetera, so that if it's ever challenged, you have the audit trail to say we did our work to keep this private. So really interesting. Take a look at that one. It's short, but it's really impactful. So, I would like to turn to a really fun topic, which is compliance officer compensation. And this is always spicy. It's coming from our friend Matt Kelly at Radical Compliance. He had a write up of an analysis of recruiting for Baker Gilmore's annual salary survey, and it's pretty good news. So, this one is really broad. It looks at small, medium, and very large companies and then basically divides up by quartile how much people are earning. So there's a very big pay gap between large and smaller companies, unsurprising. So at the very bottom, the bottom quartile of companies which have revenues under 500 million, the average salary for a chief compliance officer there is 220,000 with bonuses of about 60,000 and long-term incentives of another 50. So the total comp package on the lower end for chief compliance officers about 326,000. However, on the flip side, the highest 10% of companies with revenues from 1 to 5 billion are fat and happy CCOs earning on average 387,000 in salary, average bonus of almost their entire salary, 364,000 and long-term incentives of another 364, adding up to $918,000 in total annual compensation, which Matt Kelly said, somebody said, "Who is making that kind of money and can you introduce me?" So I thought that was quite good fun. So Matt Kelly noted that CCO compensation is largely the same as last year, but that folks in those smaller companies have experienced a 4% bump on average. And that other point was that 55% of CCOs responding to the survey this year report directly to the CEO, which is a significant increase from 10 years ago when the number was just 38%. So it's going in the right direction. Now, Tom, what do you think of these numbers? So the distribution curve is very wide, right? And there aren't a huge number of people up in that near million range. But generally speaking, I mean, I think this is pretty good news.
I absolutely agree with you, Christy. It shows it's trending in the right direction. I think one of the things that Matt focused on was this disparity between lawyer CCOs and
Hmm.
non-lawyer CCOs, that there's still a premium for lawyers. Hopefully we'll move away from that. I just concluded teaching a compliance class at Case Western University where in the law school and half the class were MBAs. And and the number 3 student was the one undergrad who was a process engineer.
Ah,
And I told her, you have to go into compliance. This is in your DNA. And she was all about the numbers. And so if you can wed sort of that numbers to the kinds of skills you and I learned and have grown up with, I think that's what will take compliance to the next level. And I hope that is compensated for. But I absolutely agree with you. I found this to be, I thought it was even greater news than perhaps certainly than Matt thought, because anytime you're trending upward in this economy like we're having now, it's certainly good. And like you said, where are these people? Do they need any help? If you've been there 3 years, you're probably ready to move on. Just give us a call.
good. All right. Let's talk about why these people are paid a lot, which is FCPA issues. Tom.
Sure. Mike Volkov wrote about FCPA enforcement against individuals. And You and I certainly focus on the corporate enforcement actions or the paucity of corporate enforcement actions, but we've had some interesting news recently and indeed this week on our one person was sentenced or pled rather after Mike's article came out, someone involved in the vital trading scandal. But probably before that, or in August 8th, the biggest news was Smartmatic had individuals literally up to the CEO charged with FCPA violations. It's a company that makes election equipment, software and machines, and they were alleged to have bribed Filipino election officials so that the Philippines would purchase their equipment. So that was the indictments were unsealed. We haven't had pleas yet from those individuals, so they still are not guilty at this point. Nevertheless, it was a pretty big blast from the Department of Justice, and Mike reports on that. He also reports on two other individuals, Julian Ayers and Deepak Sharma, who have pled guilty to FCPA enforcement actions. Deepak Sharma around trying to bribe the government of Nepal's airline corporation. It's a state-owned enterprise. And Julian Ayers was involved in the trying to bribe South Africa Airways, also a state-owned enterprise. So it's important to remember that there are individual consequences to FCPA violations. Although Mike didn't talk about this, he focused on the FCPA, the Serious Fraud Office has now brought a series of charges, what we would call indictments against individuals formerly with Glencore and their trading function, so that they are claiming the individual traders bribed government officials to purchase Glencore traded oil. So it's going to be interesting to see. Serious Fraud Office has not had a lot of good publicity lately. I think it's turned around with their new director, and he's certainly saying the right things and I think doing the right things. And it's going to be a big test to see if the SFO can get convictions or get guilty pleas from these former Glencore traders.
Tom, obviously, we've been hearing for a long time that individual action is critical, right? Because companies don't bribe people. Do you think that it's having the feel very strongly about that? Do you feel, do you think that the individual actions are making a dent? Does it change the matter? Or is it just kind of this is part of how it all works and costs of doing business, right? Because we talked a couple of weeks ago about is this just the cost of doing business because there aren't debarments very often or the really catastrophic consequences. Are companies, do you think, and executives aware about the individual punishment, and is it actually deterring them?
I, I don't think at the individual level I would view it as a cost of doing business. I think at the individual level, it's something different. And so you hear numbers thrown around that 80% of employees are going to follow the rules, 10% you have to watch or have some controls over them, and 10% are just narcissistic criminals that are going to do anything, anytime, for any reason to make money. I don't know if any of that's true, but I think most people are going to follow the rules, or at least if you're watching them, they're going to follow the rules. There's going to be some people that try to cheat the system or game the system by paying bribes. And then there's going to be some, and I would say in the energy space, this is what I saw the most often. It's always a series of little bitty steps. Not following the rules in your expense account, not following the rules in something culture says how much you make in sales is more important than whether you completed your compliance training for your bonus. All of these incentives and everything sort of lines up, and they may have taken somebody out to lunch or to dinner and done some nice things for them, and then that becomes cash. And my favorite example is there was one Houston energy company that they paid, I think the bribe was $100,000 and the final fine and penalty was over 40 million. So it's
Oof.
just, yeah, way. And so those sorts of things, I do think it's important, certainly that the DOJ do this. I think individual accountability is something that we can talk about. And if there's some percentage of a workforce that's going to stop and think because somebody like you and I stands up and says just what I just said, then you too can go to jail for 15 years, that they may think about that and that may stop them. So certainly for that reason, I think we should continue that. And of course, it's illegal.
Yes, I'm definitely on the individual prosecution train for sure. Okay, so let's shift gears to something that's even less happy. which is a story from the Wall Street Journal titled Bank of America Urges Bankers to Sound Alarm, otherwise known as whistleblowing, on overwork after the Wall Street Journal investigation. So it brings back some unhappy memories relating to my days in Big Law, the many years I spent there. This is a follow-on piece from the Wall Street Journal's absolutely excellent investigative reporting on bankers being forced to lie about their hours so they fall under the 100-hour per week maximum that they're supposed to be on. No, we're not doing a modern slavery story because these people are very well paid, but at the same time, there are reasonable and unreasonable things in life. The push is to stop the bankers working insane and dangerous hours. It started 10 years ago when one of the associates died after working too many hours in a row. That anger was reignited in May this year when a Bank of America associate died of a blood clot found in his coronary artery under horrible conditions. And unfortunately, he left a wife and two children. Bank of America has responded by saying that they're disciplining managers who've been asking junior bankers not to report their true hours. And to their credit, managers have been making public statements at the firm to the junior associates to take Saturdays off and not work more than 100 hours each week. Junior bankers candidly told the Wall Street Journal that they were afraid to report the requests to understate their hours because others in their group would be getting ahead, and many of them are hoping to rise through the rank to managing director, which comes with an annual compensation of $1 million or more. So it was very reminiscent of me. I worked in Big Law in the 2010s, and there was more than one story of associates dying from overwork and certainly some from suicide. Bank of America is talking the right talk, but changing that culture, oh my God, not just at Bank of America, but in investment banking in general, very difficult. What do you think they and the investment banking world need to do to make this right?
So I had 3 years that I billed over 3,000 hours. That is about, I think it was 70 hours a week. It's just
Just
not
billed
even,
though. You never just do billable hours, right? There's a third on top of that.
you need to come to Tom Fox's School of Advanced Billing. Yeah, no more need be said.
Okay.
But this is not 70 hours a week. The minimum they're talking here is 80 hours a week, and they're walking 100 hours. I mean, how many days are there in a week? And you're supposed to get a day off? Do the math. This is just insane. And we have talked about this before. We both grew up in that culture. And when try to compare my experience, we weren't even close to this. I mean, the only time I worked that hard was when I was in trial. And that's because
Mhm.
I couldn't sleep. I could get 100 hours in a 5-day week. But at the end of those 5 days, you can't think, you can't
No.
talk, you can't do anything. But that's not what we're talking about on this episode or this topic, because there is a major disconnect between what management said they wanted after the death 10 years ago of a junior banker and what was implemented. And number one, because somehow middle management either didn't get the memo or refused to put the memo in place. And they actively told their employees to lie, cheat, and engage in fraud by not reporting their hours. So the internal control, which was supposed to be in place, that told HR that junior banker Tom Fox has now worked 95 hours and he should not be assigned any more work, HR, that control never kicked in. So that's sort of point one. And this is not a failure of internal controls. This is not an override of internal controls. This is internal controls not being used. Why on earth at one of the most technologically
Mm.
sophisticated companies in the world are you manually entering your time? Uh, of course they knew how many hours those people were working because their computers were on. It doesn't, you're logged in from home, your computer's on. And they're forcing the junior employees to fulfill the internal control. And that is wrong. You can't have the person who's being controlled enforcing the control. And that's what they're asking the junior employees to do. But the thing that here's what I wanted to explore with you and why I think this is just insidious is what is the message this is communicating to the junior banker? What message do they get when they are told we have an absolute policy that you must not follow?
Mm.
And if you follow it, you will be sanctioned. There was one example of an employee who went through channels, went through his direct manager and HR and got an approved vacation. In response, his manager assigned him in office work on Christmas Day. And that was clear retaliation. And anyone who reported hours accurately was retaliated against. Obviously, this is an incredibly toxic culture, but that toxicity is not going to end. And it doesn't end by a memo from senior managers saying, oh, no, do this, follow, write your hours down. Horse hockey. That's sort of point one, the toxic culture and how long is that going to stay at Bank of America? But when those people leave and they have a huge departure rate, I don't know how, but I'm sure the numbers are 70, 80%, that they're going to take that cultural philosophy to wherever they go. And they are going to infect other companies with that. And so I think this is a huge cultural miasma. And what it is telling these young, both associates and junior bankers, or interns, I should say, not associates, that lying, cheating, and engaging in fraud is acceptable here at Bank of America. And if you want to succeed, you're going to have to do that. And those are the people who engage in FCPA violations when they become senior bankers.
Whew. All right. I agree. We could talk about that one for hours, man. All right. So let's bring in the next one, which we've got so many really interesting articles this week, Tom. I love this one that you brought in. Why don't you tell us about the different perspectives between executives and board members about just how well they're doing?
Right. So this comes to us from the Harvard Law School Forum on Corporate Governance. If you do not subscribe to this, please do. It is an excellent resource just for this topic of corporate governance. It's free, comes out daily. And some of the top commentators literally across the globe write pieces for this site. And I had really never thought about, Kristy, the relationship between C-suite and the board. And that's what they're focusing on. And it turns out that they see each other very differently. The C-suite tends to not think the board's not doing its job. And that may be because the board is not engaging in effective oversight. It may be because the board certainly has credentials that are appropriate and even outstanding, but they really don't have subject matter expertise. And that the C-suite becomes a little nervous or territorial when the board starts to talk to them about C-suite refreshment, C-suite replacement, bringing new blood into the C-suite. The C-suite generally doesn't have that ability upwards to the board, but if it's a strong CEO and that CEO sits on the board, you can have that problem as well. I had really not thought about this. You and I think, talk a lot about the CCO and the board and explore that relationship, but this one's a little bit different. And it's clear to me that there's a huge perception gap between the board and the C-suite over their respective roles.
Yeah. So this article really listed a survey of how board members view themselves versus how the C-suite folks on the board view the board members, the non-exec directors. And one of the points that had huge divergence was on whether or not essentially there was enough board turnover. And the answer for the board members was, of course there is. And for the C-suite was, heck, no, there's not. And I think that we really haven't been able to overcome the fact that there is such a lack of gender diversity and other types of diversity. And part of that is just the sort of institutional nature of people being what they called overboarded. So one person gets on a board and now they're on, and there's not space for other types. And the article recommended doing assessments, board member assessments every year so that there could be a better refresh period. But I don't know about you, Tom, but even in our industry, I've seen boards not function well because people don't get kicked off. They don't leave. There's senses of loyalty and friendship. And that, frankly, feels bigger than the mission of the organization or the company. So I'm not sure what the right answer is here, but I do think it flagged a really big problem that sometimes you got to mix up the party, people. That's important.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move over to Europe. This is another CCI article. It's by author Karen Schuler. And Miss Schuler pits the biggest of European compliance laws against each other battle royale. She makes the heady claim that the EU AI Act, that's way too many vowels, isn't it? EU AI, it's too many, is a much bigger deal than the European General Data Protection Regulation, frequently abbreviated to GDPR. So, what is her reasoning? First, the EU AI Act applies to systems, which have a farther reach than individual privacy rights, as systems are a broader category and AI doesn't just deal with individuals. And next, she notes that the GDPR is grounded in a principles based approach. So it asks organizations to use ideas like what's fair, reasonable security to evaluate their use of personal data. And that contrasts really very brightly with the granular and systematic approach that the EU has taken with the AI Act. From there, the article explains how GDPR spawned 1,000 similar laws throughout the world in the states on privacy. And she posits, I think correctly, that the EU AI Act will do the same. So, in this battle royale, Tom, is she right? Is the EU AI Act bigger than GDPR? I mean, every individual, all 7 billion of us, have individual data privacy rights. Not all of us are dealing with AI. What do you think?
I don't think it's bigger. I certainly think it builds on it. But I guess what I would try to argue, Christy, is it's the EU leading the way in a different area, perhaps tangential or immediately adjacent to GDPR. Nevertheless, for me, the action is the EU actually passing the act and elevating it, the standards. They're leading the world on this. And we are sadly far behind in the United States, both on data privacy and certainly on AI, although some states are starting to tackle AI, and obviously California has some data privacy rights. So I think the message for me before I read this article and after I read this article is the same, which is the EU's leading the way. And I don't, maybe it'll outpace it because maybe AI will become so ubiquitous, but I just see them as either complementary or supplementary or tangential, but they stand next to each other. And they're things that you and I are going to have to deal with, and you and I are going to have to learn about. And equally important, are people in the United States going to follow these, or are we going to go to a different direction?
To be determined. All right, Tom, to our bipartisan segment on corruption, what is happening with our friends in Congress?
George Santos, perhaps the biggest clown in Congress, short of Matt Gaetz or any of the other Republicans, pled guilty this week and pled guilty to everything that he'd been charged with, basically. And so turns out everything everyone was saying about him was true. He lied, cheated, and stole. He did it from his constituents. He did it from the Republican National Committee. He did it to the Federal Election Commission. And I doubt he's going to get his desire for time served or home arrest. Senator Robert Menendez, sadly, resigned from Congress on August 20th. He had been convicted of bribery, a receipt of bribes, the gold bars case, plus $480,000 in cash in his home. Tried to claim it was his wife. She was the bad person, but the jury didn't buy that. So really a sad ending. He had a 50-year career in politics, a very sad ending to his career. I don't know what planet George Santos came from, and who knows what his original name was, whatever incarnation he is now. Maybe he's an alien. Oh, I don't know. But some political corruption where they did have to pay the cost of their crimes.
Yeah, it'll be interesting because the Supreme Court had some interesting rulings on domestic political contributions and when they count as bribery or not. But I'm pretty sure for both of these cases, that doesn't matter. They're going down.
Right.
Right. All right. Shall we end with the state of Florida man?
Absolutely.
Okay. So this time, Florida man Jose Marti Alvarez is facing felony charges for a bizarre but clever impersonation scheme that left customers fuming mad. There is a famous pizza joint in Miami called Roman's Pizzeria. It's owned by Jesus Roman, who has been cooking up fan favorites for decades. His pizza is so popular that visitors to the area's hotels love to order it in their room. And guess what? That was so easy to do since there were frequently flyers for Roman's Pizzeria left in their rooms. Guests just called the number on the flyer, boom, pizza's delivered. Just one problem. The number didn't lead to the real Roman's Pizzeria. It led to Mr. Marty Alvarez's phone. So our Florida man would dutifully create really terrible pizzas in his oven and deliver them cold and miserable to unsuspecting hotel guests. Sometimes, this is pretty classy, he left raw dough in the box. So that's a raw deal. The real owner of Roman's
So
Pizzeria,
bad.
it's amazing. The real owner of Roman's Pizzeria was baffled by the terrible reviews he was getting from hotels and the complaints to the Better Business Bureau. He went to the police, and as word of the scheme got out, when Mr. Marty Alvarez tried to deliver his faulty flyers at one of the hotels, a member of staff chased him out, and as he fled, managed to hit another employee with his car. That person's okay. Mr. Marty Alvarez faces charges of aggravated battery as well as organizing a scheme to defraud. Our Florida man thought he'd be rolling in dough, but in the end was caught and charged for his cheesy crimes. Oh, Tom. All right. Thank you so much for joining us here at Two Gurus Talk Compliance. I'm Christy Granhart.